Tonight, the city of London lies beneath an iron-coloured sky, breathing white air. The streets are locked stiff under a shine that isn't wet, it's death itself. Horses collapse without warning. Carriages slide sideways, coffins on wheels. Even the river has gone still, not peaceful, but stopped, frozen mid-motion. In this deep freeze, sound behaves strangely. Footsteps crunch like breaking bones. Breath crackles like burning paper. Windows gather frost that looks like tears, as if the houses themselves are grieving something unnamed. Before we begin, a quick word to those listening in the dark. If you're tuning in from the US, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, the Middle East, South America, or from some sleepless corner of the planet I haven't named, welcome. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I read them all. And if you enjoy these slow, haunting bedtime stories from history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a note. It helps these quiet stories find more insomniacs, night drivers, and wanderers like you. Now, before we sink fully into London, 1879, a winter so merciless, it didn't just freeze the city, it sealed it. Get yourself ready. Settle your pillow. Dim the light. Breathe slower. Let the blanket sit heavy and sure around you. Let the room grow still. Let the sounds outside your door drift away. Let this century start to fade behind you, quietly, plank by plank. When you're ready, we'll return to that winter, when the streets turned to glass, the river to stone, and a living city began to feel like a coffin being quietly shut. It didn't begin with a blizzard or a howling wind, but with a silence so complete it felt designed, like someone had pulled a velvet curtain over the world. Londoners woke to windows coated in crystal, to milk freezing solid before it reached the table, to chamber pots cracking from the cold, and coal fires that burned sullen and low. The air itself had a metallic taste, the taste of iron just before it struck. Street lamps glowed inside their halos of fog, shrinking the night into a small golden dome cupped in frost. Down by the Thames, bargemen tested the water with long poles, expecting thin ice. But what they heard was worse, wood striking something solid. The river wasn't just crusted over, it was hardening from within, turning cloudy and pale like a body dying in slow motion. If you knelt and listened, you could hear it tightening, not a crack, but a low groan, like wood swelling under a coffin lid. In the narrow alleys off Fleet Street, breath rose like steam from a slaughterhouse. Mothers stuffed rags into keyholes to block the drafts, but the cold still crept in, under doors, behind plaster, through the bones. It was an intelligent cold, a selective cold. Not the playful frost on postcards, but the kind that strips away choice. Walk slower, eat faster, sleep closer, fear sooner. And yet, within that suffering, there was a hush, a quiet that made even misery feel sacred. A winter silence so thick that a horse's hoof sounded like a knuckle tapping on wood. People spoke softly. Even arguments came out muted. The world's pulse had slowed, and London, without realizing, had started to resemble a body prepared for burial. The second day of the freeze didn't begin with a sunrise. The sky simply shifted from black to pewter, as if daylight itself was too tired to try. Overnight, the cold had thickened again, drawing tighter around the city like a second wall. People didn't wake because they'd rested. They woke because the cold forced them out of sleep, pressing into their marrow, their teeth, the soft places behind the eyes. In the poorer homes, the loudest sound wasn't talking. It was the hollow knock of empty coal buckets. Those who still had coal burned it sparingly, almost guiltily,
feeding the fire by spoonfuls. Every ember was rationed like gold dust. The warmth no longer filled a room. It hovered in a shrinking circle, barely large enough for one body. Children pressed their hands against stove rims until the skin mottled red and white, then tucked them under their arms, trapping what heat they could like stolen light. Bread hardened in its cloth, fat congealed on every plate, candles leaned stiffly, their wax colder than bone, ink clotted in its wells so that letters, written in grief or in business, ended mid-stroke, frozen. Laundry left outside didn't sway. It snapped, tin stiff. Even breathing hurt. Air entered sharp and left smoky, as if the lungs smouldered from within. Out in the streets, the frost didn't just dust the world, it buried it. Layer over layer, until the gutters bulged with frozen filth, and the walls shone like glass. The cold preserved everything it touched. Dead rats looked carved from wax. Spilled beer froze mid-drip. Even horse dung hardened into neat, perfect mounds, as if arranged by careful hands. Nothing decayed.
Nothing moved. It was preservation by suffocation, death without decomposition. Along the riverbanks, people gathered not to trade or to pray, but to listen. The ice on the Thames let out long, body-deep sounds, slow moans, sharp cracks that travelled up through boot soles into bone. Those who stood along the frozen edge didn't look like citizens anymore. They looked like witnesses at a public burial. A low fog rolled across the river, slow, deliberate, and when it thinned, you could see boats trapped in place, frozen mid-motion as if an invisible hand had clenched around them. No one said it aloud, but a thought had begun to drift quietly through the city, passed from door to door like a rumour. If the river could stop, maybe life itself could pause next. By the third day, the cold was no longer an event. It was law. London now lived under its rule. People began to move differently, speak differently, even think differently. Conversation became a transaction. Every word cost warmth, so sentences grew shorter, slower, softer. Laughter was rare, and when it did appear, it sounded brittle, like glass tapped with a fingernail. The markets, usually loud and steaming with noise, had turned skeletal. Fishmongers stood behind benches where haddock and eels lay stiff as carvings, their skin frosted over like sugared fruit. Meat, once abundant, was disappearing. Butchers slaughtered fewer animals, not for lack of supply, but because the blood froze before it could be cleaned, fusing knives to bone, turning the work of butchery into something closer to sculpting marble. The few cuts that still hung from hooks looked embalmed, bright, clean, and lifeless, more like warnings than meals. Hunger began to change the sound of the city. In the wealthier districts, hunger murmured behind curtains, muffled by linen and manners. But in the poorer quarters, it rang openly, spoons tapping empty bowls, pots scraped down to metal, babies crying with the thin, serrated wail of withheld milk. Men chewed scraps of fabric to trick their mouths into thinking they'd eaten. Women boiled the same bones 3, 4, 5 times until the broth tasted only of steam. Anything that could be eaten, candle wax, oats meant for horses, became precious. Crossing the streets had turned into a kind of survival art. The black ice beneath the frost was invisible, a trapdoor waiting. People learned to test each step sideways, to move as though carrying glass. A fall wasn't just dangerous, it could be deadly. A fractured skull in a city too cold to bleed. Even the animals obeyed the new order. Dogs moved low and silent, ribs standing out like script beneath the skin. Horses trembled where they stood, their breath leaving in quick bursts. The stables smelled of iron, wet wool and fear, the scent of a place that knew more would die than live. And yet, behind shutters and quilts, Some still lit a single candle and whispered that every winter eventually breaks, though no one could say when or what would remain of London when it did. By the fourth day, the Thames was no longer a river, but an artifact, a long white scar splitting the city in two. Where water once moved with the slow weight of tide and industry, there was now only a shell of ice, dull in some places, glassy and lethal in others. The current beneath had been strangled into silence. Bargemen, men who'd spent their lives reading the river's moods, its slap, hiss, and murmur, said the strangest thing wasn't the ice itself, but the quiet. As if the city's heartbeat had been surgically removed. They tested the surface with iron rods, listening for its note. A low, dull thud meant safety. A high, sharp ring meant death. The rods came up rimmed with frost that clung to metal like pale fur. The ice didn't crack. It groaned, slow and heavy, like the beams of a dying ship. One child tried to step out and was pulled back by the collar, not out of fear of drowning, but of being found months later, perfectly preserved under the glass. The riverbanks smelled wrong, rope hemp, cold tar, salt, animal hair, and something faintly sweet, as though decay had tried to begin but froze halfway through. Fog coiled low over the ice like breath from a sleeping animal. It moved sluggishly, folding and unfolding, swallowing shapes, a cart, a man, a dog, and then releasing them yards away, as if time itself had been cut and spliced. Coal barges stood locked in place like siege engines. Their ropes were rigid as iron bars, thick with frost. The masts creaked faintly, dry and papery, as though the ships were trying to remember what wind felt like. People lined the embankments and watched them, the way you watch patients in a hospital ward, waiting to see which would survive the night. And now the talk began. Quiet, shivering, but sure. If the cold held, the river would soon bear weight. People could cross it. Trade could move across it. Maybe stalls could rise upon it. It wasn't an unheard of idea. Frost fairs had been held before. But this freeze felt different. This wasn't a picturesque winter out of folklore. This one didn't decorate London. It arrested it. It embalmed it. People began to feel like they were already inside history, trapped beneath glass. Even those who scoffed at omens spoke in whispers by the river. It didn't look like a miracle of nature anymore. It looked like a lid being shut. By the fifth night, the cold wasn't just outside. It had invaded the home, creeping into the soft spaces where life once felt safe. Parlours that used to smell of beeswax and tea now smelled faintly of wet wool, extinguished flame and human breath drying on cold glass. Carpets stiffened at the edges, wallpaper peeled from plaster in curling leaves as ice crystals formed between wall and paste. Even the sound of a room had changed. Footsteps echoed sharper now, as if wood and plaster had turned to stone. People slept fully dressed, shirts, shawls, coats, blankets, yet still woke shivering. Frost grew heavy on quilts where breath condensed and froze through the night. Water in basins turned solid and clear enough to reflect the ceiling. Hair froze where it brushed against windows. Cats curled close behind their owners' backs, their fur tipped white with frost. In the wealthier homes, fires fought losing battles. Coal burned fast and joyless, as though frightened by its own flame. Logs cracked and exploded, sap inside bursting into sparks. Even so, the heat no longer filled a room. It stayed close, a small guarded circle. Beyond it, the air was cold enough to see breath. The sound of breaking glass became a daily punctuation, window panes straining under the temperature, splintering into white-veined fractures. Homeowners stuffed rags into frames, hammered boards over doors, stacked sandbags along thresholds. It wasn't weather they were fighting anymore. It was siege. People began hoarding warmth the way they once hoarded money. They sat shoulder to shoulder, not out of affection, but survival, sharing body heat like contraband. Tea was sipped not for taste, but to keep hands alive. Letters were warmed under palms before being opened, as if words themselves might shatter if touched too cold. London wasn't starving yet, or rioting, or burying its dead in heaps. But something invisible had been crossed. Comfort was gone. London no longer felt inhabited. It felt endured. By the 6th day, it was clear. The cold did not strike all of London equally. In the narrow courts east of St. Paul's, where roofs sagged and walls already wept with damp, the freeze wasn't an inconvenience. It was an executioner. Water pumps seized. The little water they gave came out in sluggish ropes before freezing into glassy icicles at the spout. Windows were stuffed with newspaper, but drafts slipped through like fingers. Rooms smelled of boiled starch, damp lungs, and wet cloth that refused to dry. Charity wagons rolled through with bread that cracked like brick when broken. Men tore it with their teeth. Knives slid uselessly off the crust. Soup kitchens poured thin grey broth that steamed for seconds before turning flat and cold. People cupped their bowls not to eat, but to thaw their fingers. Beds were shared by rotation, bodies taking turns beneath the same blankets, passing warmth like inheritance. Those who couldn't fit slept upright, pressed together like sacks of grain. Babies were wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth existed, their breath freezing into white dust over their lips. Mothers scraped ice off the walls with spoons and fed it to crying children just to quiet them. And beneath all this, a subtler crisis began. Illness lost its smell. The freeze halted rot, muted sweat. Even fevered bodies gave off no warning scent. Coughing echoed down the stairwells, wet, heavy, unstoppable, yet the air stayed deceptively clean, as if death itself had been sterilized before taking its host. Sickness could now spread silently. When night returned, it came with total authority. The streets went black and brittle, lamps haloed in frost, footsteps vanishing into stillness. Now and then came the scrape and thud of someone falling, and often they stayed down, not dead, just unwilling to spend the warmth it would take to stand. In the rich districts, people were merely cold, but in the city's hidden lungs, the slums and rookeries, people had begun to weaken. By the 7th day, the cold had rationed everything, food, water, even fire. Coal was no longer measured by the sack, but by the handful, by the hour, by the argument. Families counted how long they could afford a flame the way sailors count rope, not with hope, but with math and dread. Chimneys sent up thin, reluctant trails of smoke, as if embarrassed by their own extravagance. In some homes, the hearth burned just long enough to heat a single brick. Then it was wrapped in cloth and carried to bed like a small living creature. People boiled water not to drink, but to fill their rooms with quick, vanishing clouds of steam. Fire wasn't comfort anymore. It was strategy. The air carried the smell of desperate substitutions, singed hair from women leaning too close to candles, scorched fabric used as kindling. Smoke from furniture burned piece by piece so children wouldn't stiffen in their sleep. Old debts were paid in wood. A chair owed years ago might finally be returned, straight into the stove. In taverns, men gathered not for ale but for the nearness of heat. The beer came cold, its foam flat and lifeless. Pipes were smoked with mittened hands. Tobacco clung to the rafters, stale and heavy, mixing with the frozen air. Conversations circled numbers. How many days left before the coal yard closes? How many fingers can a man lose and still work? How many nights before the frozen river stops being danger and becomes a road? Even churches trembled under the cold. Sanctuaries felt like tombs. Breath rolled from praying mouths like ghostly incense. Candles gave light, not warmth. Hymns were sung in lower keys, voices cracked when raised. Frost traced the altar rails, and scripture pages turned stiff in the hands. Faith itself seemed to move through ice. The city wasn't panicking. Panic needs motion. London was shrinking inward, every gesture careful, every word measured. That's how catastrophe begins in a place trained by time and class. Not with screams, but with silence. Not collapse, but calculation. Somewhere between pride and survival, people grasped a harder truth. Winter wasn't testing them anymore. It was collecting payment. By the 8th day, the frost had settled in like an uninvited guest. It lived inside the walls now. Windows stopped being windows. They turned into panels of crystal. Each pane carried its own landscape, fern-like patterns spreading in perfect symmetry, as if the cold itself were signing its name. Outside, the world felt distant, unreachable, yet those frozen pictures mirrored the inside, hunched bodies, shaking hands, bent shoulders. Isolation turned visible. Inside, people learned new ways the cold could hurt. Bread and butter hardened into brittle slabs that cracked at the lightest touch. Porridge thickened into paste before it could be eaten. Bowls froze to the table. Spoons scraped through them with a sound like nails on stone. Even the water hesitated to exist, forming jagged cubes where droplets used to rest. The room smelled of damp wool, cold smoke and human sweat, a scent both intimate and oppressive. Children clung to their parents, faces pale and shiny from the chill. Their eyes carried a strange alertness, the quiet calculation of beings already learning that warmth was work. They listened. The snap of ice beneath a boot, the hollow roll of a frozen barrel, the distant creak of a tree straining under its own frozen weight. Every sound was a story, a warning, a lullaby. In wealthier homes, the cold came softer, but it still came. Fires were kept deliberately low. Coal was too precious to waste. Curtains stayed closed to trap what little warmth remained, air thick with smoke and stillness. People moved slowly, saving energy, treating heat like a currency. Voices were hushed. Laughter was rare, a brief rebellion against the freeze. Even sleep felt like negotiation. Bodies curled tight, breathing shallow, wrapped in blankets like cocoons of borrowed life. Outside, London looked like a city caught between two heartbeats. Horses trembled in their harnesses, carriages stood still, and the streets glittered with ice. The Thames stretched wide and white, a mirror that refused to move. The river had stopped being a trade route. It had become a frozen artery, echoing the stillness of the city it ran through. Everywhere the same quiet question passed between walls and windows. How long can warmth survive before it becomes only a memory? By the 9th day, even the buildings seemed to whisper. Frost thickened on the glass until windows groaned beneath it. Doors shivered in their frames. Shutters rattled like teeth. Every home had turned into a living thing, creaking, sighing, adjusting to the weight of the cold. London itself was alive, but in a different way. It moaned, cracked, warned. Families adapted. Kitchens no longer smelled of baking bread, only of boiled water and faint smoke. Clothes froze stiff on chairs. Curtains swayed under steady draughts, brushing walls like slow, patient ghosts. Words were chosen carefully, voices soft, every syllable rationed. Even arguments were whispered. The rooms themselves seemed to listen. Children watched frost bloom on the glass, tracing its veins with their fingertips until the cold bit back. Some tapped gently, testing if ice could break under a whisper. Others pressed their cheeks to the window, fogging it with breath, watching it vanish almost instantly. Play had become a survival exercise. Laughter was quiet, movement careful, warmth sacred.
The streets outside were treacherous, a maze of frozen glass. Ice coated everything, smooth and jagged all at once. One wrong step could send a person sliding into a wall or cart. Horses tested the ground with slow precision, hooves clicking in rhythm with the city's uneasy silence. Snow had hardened into crust, crunching like brittle bone. Smoke from chimneys twisted and vanished too quickly, erased by the sharp air. And yet, within this frozen stillness, small sparks of life endured. A dog pawing at a door, a child holding a warm brick under blankets, a candle trembling but refusing to die. Each flicker meant something, a quiet defiance, proof that warmth and hope could still exist, fragile but alive. By the 10th day, London had turned to glass. Every cobblestone, every puddle, every inch of dirt froze solid, shining in the pale daylight like the pieces of a shattered mirror. Footsteps no longer sank softly. They struck the earth with the sound of survival. Their boots clicked and skated over the ice, the sound echoing through narrow alleys and wide, frozen avenues alike. People walked as if carrying a fragile secret, leaning forward slightly, arms extended for invisible balance. One wrong move could send a body sliding, quietly, inevitably, like a leaf drifting down a frozen stream. But this stream was solid, merciless, and without mercy. Shadows stretched long in the weak winter sun, pressed flat against walls, streets, and the icy skin of the river. They whispered, and the mind filled in the rest. A child might see a long-reaching hand. A woman might glimpse a horse without eyes. Every sound outside carried a question. Was that snow cracking, ice shifting, or something else moving beneath? Even the wind seemed to hesitate, thin and metallic, leaving a faint taste of frost on the air wherever it passed. At the markets, vendors hunched over their frozen wares, hands buried deep in scarves or stitched together gloves. Apples had turned hard as stones, potatoes split in glittering halves, meat stiffened like wax under glass. No one shouted prices anymore. Trade had become silent, gestures, nods, and quick exchanges. Even coins bit the skin, metal cold enough to sting. Children followed behind their parents, clutching coats and skirts, memorizing the creak of each door, the shine of each icy patch, the hush that ruled the streets. Along the frozen Thames, the river gleamed like a sheet of silver glass. Barges sat locked in place, ropes and sails frozen stiff, masts groaning softly under unseen pressure. Now and then, a block of ice shifted, releasing a low, rolling moan that echoed like distant thunder, startling birds into brief flight before silence returned. The city had gone quiet, but not dead. Life hummed faintly beneath it all, the scrape of boots, the murmur of prayer, the soft clink of metal as people carried what little they could. Inside, windows reflected that frozen world back at their watchers. London had become a labyrinth of grey and silver, cold, beautiful, dangerous, mesmerizing. And yet, in corners of that crystalline stillness, warmth survived. A single burning candle, a shared blanket, a child clutching a heated brick, small acts of rebellion against the frost. By the 11th night, darkness itself had changed. It was no longer just the absence of light. It was a weight, a presence pressing down over the city. Windows glowed faintly from within, but the light seemed trapped, smothered behind frost-heavy glass. The air smelled of cold smoke and damp wood, a taste you could almost chew, bitter, metallic and thick. Families huddled close around dying hearths, guarding the last glowing embers like relics. Fingers pressed against brick for warmth, blankets drawn tight around shoulders, children tucked deep into folds of adult coats. Even breathing had become a conscious act, sharp on the inhale, then visible, glittering briefly in the frozen air before vanishing. Rooms crackled softly, the sound of ice forming or breaking, of melting frost sighing down the glass. Voices were low, meant to comfort, not to disturb. Outside, the streets were a cautious dance. Footsteps slid, carts scraped, frozen timber creaked in warning. Lanterns glowed through the frost, their halos splitting into 1,000 tiny lights that made the world look fractured, dreamlike. Shadows wavered and bent, tricking tired eyes. A running horse, a passing man, a child chasing after nothing. The cold sharpened imagination until even stillness felt alive. Down by the river, the Thames groaned like a creature in its sleep, shifting under the weight of its own frozen skin. Barges strained at their ropes, which snapped and crackled as if the ice itself was pulling tighter. Sometimes, a sudden crack would echo across the night like a cannon shot,
sending a ripple of fear through those who still dared to cross. Fog lay heavy, dragging close to the ground, swallowing shapes in slow grey waves. It carried with it the earthy scent of river mud, frozen in place like everything else. Inside, warmth was no longer comfort. It was memory. Families clung to whatever heat they could, a candle flame, a small stove, the shared friction of bodies pressed together. Each knew that tomorrow the cold would return stronger. Every sound, every flicker of light reminded them. The city was trapped in a slow, deliberate freeze. Survival now depended on patience, resourcefulness, and respect for winter's quiet cruelty. By the 12th day, the cold had sunk deeper than walls and streets. It had entered people's bones. Walking no longer just chilled the skin. It hurt from the inside out, an ache that lived in the marrow. Even rest offered no escape. Muscles stiffened, joints throbbed. It felt as if the city itself had gripped its people, unwilling to release them. Inside homes, every space became a refuge. Chairs clustered near the hearth, forming small islands of warmth. Blankets layered in careful patterns to trap every ounce of heat. Parents held children close, sharing body warmth. Whispering lullabies meant more for comfort than sleep. Steam drifted from kettles, thin as mist, vanishing before it reached chilled hands. Outside, the streets were now a web of ice and shadow. Horses moved like ghosts, cautious, trembling. Carts creaked and groaned, their frozen wheels threatening to splinter under weight. Pedestrians walked with slow, learned rhythm, testing each patch of ice, listening for the warning crack beneath their boots. Every journey became a calculation, a quiet truce with the cold. Along the frozen Thames, the ice moaned, a deep, resonant hum that travelled far across the embankments. Fog curled low, weaving between half-sunken barges, swallowing their outlines in thick grey breath. The river, once a highway of trade, had become a suspended world, a place where time itself seemed frozen and life fragile enough to shatter. Even the wealthier districts were not spared. Fires burned small, rationed carefully. Candles flickered weakly, their glow barely reaching walls lined with frost. People moved slowly, each gesture deliberate. Every bit of motion, every word, every shared glance spent warmth like money. And beneath it all grew a quiet understanding. This was no passing storm. It was a siege. By the 13th day, silence had evolved into something physical. Even the ordinary sounds, the creak of chairs, footsteps on floors, the pop of firewood, came muted and strange. Breath hung in the air like ghosts. It was the kind of hush that made a whisper feel intrusive. Families moved gently, saving strength. Children pressed close, small hands finding warmth wherever they could. Conversation became a ritual, careful, soft, almost sacred. In the kitchens, Pots hissed faintly, releasing steam that vanished before it could rise. Every action, every stir, every step felt deliberate, chosen. Outside, the city was a mirror maze. Footsteps glided on cobblestones. Lanterns fractured light across frost-coated glass, turning every reflection into a moving shape. A shadow there, a figure here, imagination making ghosts of everything familiar. Horses trembled, carts rattled softly. The frozen Thames groaned in low, mournful tones, ice stretching and cracking in subtle, restless shifts. Fog wrapped around chimneys and masts, hiding the world in slow, pale waves. The frost on windows began to look alive, shifting when stared at too long. Families started to see it as a kind of presence, a silent companion, watching from the other side of the glass, reminding them how thin the line was between safety and the void. Each candle that flickered was defiance. Each blanket shared was a fortress, and through that deep silence, one truth echoed in every mind. The city endures, but only through patience and deliberate grace. By the 14th day, London felt less like a city and more like a fortress of ice. Doors refused to open easily, hinges swollen, handles biting to the touch. The streets shimmered under layers of glassy frost, turning every errand into a slow ritual of balance and care. Londoners moved differently now, slow, cautious, almost ceremonial. Each motion a fragile pact with survival. Inside, fires burned low but constant, their light weak and golden. Coal was precious, guarded like treasure. Blankets were layered and shared. Children pressed their faces to parents' chests, pale with cold, their breath freezing in the air between them. Even whispers carried weight. Outside, the silence was only broken by a sudden slip, a distant clatter, a horse exhaling steam into the dark. Lanterns cast fractured halos across the ice, stretching shadows into unfamiliar shifting shapes. Even the wind moved carefully now, slow, curling, hesitant, carrying with it the metallic scent of frost and the faint, earthy ghost of frozen mud. Down by the river, the Thames no longer divided the city. It mirrored it. A perfect, frozen reflection of London itself. Still, watchful, enduring. Barges sat frozen in place, their ropes stiff and cracking under the weight of frost. The masts creaked softly, straining against the cold. A thin fog clung to the river's surface like a living thing, hiding the slow shifts of the ice beneath and making it seem as if the river itself still breathed under its frozen skin. Those who dared to approach the edge stepped carefully, scanning for cracks, listening for every faint groan that might warn of collapse. Even in the wealthier neighborhoods, the frost's grip was absolute. Windows shimmered with delicate ice patterns, and fires burned low, reluctant to give their warmth. Every movement had become cautious, intentional. Life itself was now a quiet negotiation with the cold, a fragile dance between endurance and surrender. And in every home, along every silent street, one thought repeated like a heartbeat. The city must endure, no matter how deep the winter cut. By the 15th day, London's marketplaces looked like scenes locked in glass. Where there was once laughter and the clatter of trade, now there was only stillness. Stalls stood frozen in place, covered in rime and snow. Fruits gleamed like jewels, beautiful, but hard as stone. Vegetables shattered at a touch. Meat hung stiff and pale, frozen into strange crystalline shapes. Fish lay like sculptures, eyes glazed, gills frozen mid-breath. Vendors huddled together, their faces pale and raw from the cold, hands jammed into pockets or pressed against their bodies for warmth. No one shouted or bartered anymore. Deals were made with nods and gestures, slow movements of numb fingers that dared not drop a coin. Bread was rationed, porridge turned to slabs, and soups froze before they could even be eaten. Children followed close behind their parents, bundled so tightly they could barely move, their cheeks pink and eyes wide with wonder. They tapped gently on icy counters, tracing patterns in the frost, half fascinated, half afraid. Every sound, even the softest, carried across the hollow streets. The faint crack of ice, the jingle of a coin, the creak of a cartwheel, creating a fragile symphony of survival. The air in the market had changed too. The scent of baking and spice had vanished, replaced by a sharp metallic tang, frost, smoke, and damp wood. Every breath was careful and deliberate, each exhale a brief, glittering cloud that vanished into still air. Horses shifted uneasily, hooves scraping against thin ice, and carts groaned beneath their frozen loads. The city had become a glass world, dazzling, fragile, and treacherous. And yet, somehow, life carried on. A child shared a crust of bread. A vendor helped free a stuck cart. Small acts of warmth flickered quietly against the cold's relentless rule. By the 16th day, London's narrow courtyards and alleys had turned into frozen sanctuaries, small worlds trapped under glass. Snow had hardened into jagged ice, reflecting lantern light in fractured shards. Puddles had become perfect mirrors, catching the faint reflections of chimneys and faces peering from windows. Even the wind moved differently here, whispering through shutters and doorframes, carrying that same metallic scent of frost. Children discovered beauty in the stillness. They pressed their gloved fingers to icy walls, tracing frost like veins, watching it grow and twist. Their laughter, rare and brittle, echoed strangely, like glass about to crack. Parents watched, torn between awe and fear, enchanted by the frost's fragile beauty, haunted by its power to claim everything it touched. The air itself seemed heavier now, pressing close. Every sound, the creak of a shutter, the crunch of a boot, the faint scrape of a dog's paw, felt amplified, as though the city was holding its breath. Even in the wealthier homes, gardens stood transformed into white sculptures. Fountains froze mid-splash, trees bent low under ice, and every branch glittered with sharp white crystals. The few greenhouse plants still alive trembled under their glass domes. Life had slowed to deliberate rhythm, scraping frost from doorsteps, carrying wood, rationing water. Every action required care, yet within this frozen stillness, sparks of humanity glowed, a shared coat, a whispered comfort, a single candle burning stubbornly against the dark. Quiet defiance against a season that wanted to silence everything. By the 17th day, candlelight had become sacred. Every flame was precious, a fragile guardian against the suffocating cold. Wax dripped slowly, forming frozen trails that caught the light like trapped fireflies. Families gathered around each small flame, hands outstretched, faces bathed in gold. Children leaned close to the glow, watching the light flicker across walls rimmed with frost, seeing beauty in the cracks and shadows. Even the smallest movement became mesmerizing. The shifting of a blanket, the flutter of a candle's flame, transforming rooms into quiet theaters of light and life. Outside, the streets shimmered under the lanterns, ice gleaming like glass. Horses stepped cautiously, hooves tapping soft rhythms, while carts creaked and groaned across the frozen cobblestones. The city moved slowly, reverently, as if aware that sound itself might break the spell. Occasional gusts rattled shutters and stirred pale clouds of fog, carrying with them the scent of the river, cold, metallic, alive. Along the Thames, candlelight from taverns and windows scattered across the ice like fallen stars. Barges stood motionless, ropes stiff, masts outlined in silver. Every distant sound, a shout, a coin, the soft cry of an animal, echoed through the silence, magnified by the still air. Inside, Candlelight was more than warmth. It was memory, prayer, and defiance all at once. Each flicker was a reminder that even now, even here, life refused to give in. By the 18th day, the Thames had become both beautiful and menacing, a silver desert cutting through the heart of the city. Jagged ridges of ice stretched across its surface, glowing faintly under lantern light. The river groaned softly, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to come from its frozen depths. Fog rolled low, wrapping the banks in ghostly veils. People ventured near with care, boots slipping, lanterns trembling. The abandoned barges loomed like monuments to halted life, ropes stretched tight and creaking as if they, too, were alive. Occasionally, a crack would echo through the air, sharp, startling, sending birds into flight and hearts pounding. Children pressed their faces to the railings, staring at the patterns in the ice, the trapped bubbles, the faint shimmer of light. From the homes overlooking the river, people watched through windows veiled in frost. The candlelight inside seemed warm and defiant against the cold expanse beyond. The Thames, once the lifeblood of the city, was now its mirror, still silent and full of quiet menace. Yet even here, life continued. A few brave souls carried coal across the banks, leaving faint trails of warmth in their wake. Dogs padded carefully over the ice, ears perked to every sound. Birds huddled in the few bare trees that remained. The city had not surrendered. Beneath the weight of ice, beneath the heavy silence and endless frost, London still breathed, slowly, deliberately, waiting for the thaw, and holding fast to the fragile hope that winter's grip, no matter how cruel, would one day loosen. By the 19th day, the frost felt alive, pressing down with weight and purpose. Roofs sagged under the burden, tiles cracked with sharp, brittle sounds. Chimneys trembled as smoke froze mid-air, twisting into glittering spires. Trees bowed under their icy armor, every branch etched in silver. And inside, the cold no longer lingered outside the walls. It lived in the bones. It sank deeper into muscle and bone, leaving behind an ache that no blanket or fire could truly chase away. Children slept tightly pressed against their parents, trading warmth like it was currency. Every small action, reaching for water, turning a page, adjusting a candle, demanded effort, patience, and care. Sounds carried farther in the cold. A footstep, a whisper, a sigh, the crack of frozen wood. All of it rang out sharp and clear, as if the city itself had grown fragile. London moved slowly now, each person seeming to bargain with the frost itself. The cobblestones shimmered with a glaze of ice beneath the dim lanterns, throwing fractured reflections and treacherous shadows. Horses shifted their weight carefully, hooves tapping out cautious rhythms, breath billowing into brief clouds that vanished into metallic air. Carts groaned under frozen loads, wheels stiff and stubborn. Yet still, life moved forward, hesitant but determined, along the frozen Thames. The river seemed to breathe, pulsing faintly under the weight of barges and wandering footsteps, fog curling softly over its surface. Low creaks and deep groans echoed from below, reminders that the ice was alive, beautiful, but dangerous. Lantern light flickered on the glassy surface, turning the river into a trembling mirror of the frozen city above. Inside, Londoners learned something new. The frost wasn't just an obstacle, it was a force to be respected. Life unfolded in small, deliberate moments, measured steps, rationed warmth, hushed voices. Each one a quiet triumph against the relentless cold pressing from above. By the 20th day, even the air of the city seemed to breathe differently. London inhaled a metallic chill and exhaled frost and fog that spread through every street. The usual hum of trade had fallen silent. The city's pulse was slower now, muted, careful, deliberate. The shuffle of boots replaced the clatter of commerce. Inside homes, The rhythm of living had changed. Conversations were murmured, movements slow, laughter rare and brittle as ice. Families moved in quiet harmony. Children clung to their parents beneath heavy blankets, wrapped in layers of worn cloth. Every action, a reach for coal, the stirring of thick porridge, the carrying of water that froze mid-step, was a negotiation with the cold. Fingers numbed quickly, cheeks stung, and breath crystallized into tiny diamonds before dissolving into the air. Windows bore frost patterns that echoed the tension inside, delicate, intricate, unyielding. Outside, the streets glittered like rivers of glass. Lanterns fractured their light against the ice, shadows trembling with each flicker. Horses tested their footing with care, hooves clicking softly. Carts strained under their loads, the sound of their struggle echoing through a silence too deep to be natural. The Thames had hardened into a vast field of silver, holding the city's stillness like a secret. Fog rolled in heavy waves, cloaking frozen barges and lost debris. Every now and then, a low groan shuddered across the river, a warning that life still stirred beneath the ice. Candlelight shimmered along the embankment, trembling like a heartbeat. And within the homes, a single thought settled over the people. The city endured, but only through care and patience. Every breath, every motion, was part of a fragile dance with frost and silence. By the 21st day, the city had begun to listen, to its chimneys, to its walls, to itself. Smoke no longer rose freely. It crept upward in thin, stiff ribbons, twisting once before freezing in the air. The chimneys moaned softly as frost seeped into brick and mortar, sending faint vibrations through every home, more felt than heard. Families came to recognize these tiny shifts, reading them like a clock or a warning. Every sound mattered. Every tremor was a message. Inside, warmth was treated like water in a drought. Fires burned slow and low, coaxed with care. Coal was brittle, precious, and rationed precisely. Children huddled close, their faces flushed from the cold, hands clasped in shared heat. Even sleep became a strategy. Blankets layered thickly, bodies pressed together, whispers exchanged in tones soft enough not to disturb the fragile warmth that filled the room. Outside, frost ruled everything. Streets shimmered under ice so thin it could splinter with a thought. Lantern lights split into jagged reflections across the ground. Horses moved with painful caution, and carts creaked like old ships against frozen cobblestones. The wind itself seemed to bow to the freeze, curling around corners with a cold metallic scent. Along the river, the frozen Thames pulsed faintly beneath its icy crust. Barges creaked, ropes snapped softly in the wind, and fog wrapped around the masts like ghostly hands. Lanterns reflected in the frozen surface, creating trembling shards of light that mirrored the city's own tension. London had become fragile, suspended in silence. Every breath, every movement, every sound mattered. The city survived not through strength, but through attention, to the whispers of frost, the murmurs of walls, the heartbeat of survival. By the 22nd day, the silence itself had grown heavy. It pressed against windows, settled over the river, and filled the streets like fog made solid. Every noise, a cough, a step, the groan of wood, rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the still air. The quiet was no longer the absence of sound. It was something living, shaping thought and motion. Families huddled close around struggling hearths, guarding their warmth as fiercely as their food. Children pressed their faces into their parents' chests, listening to the soft formation of frost on window panes. Porridge thickened into near solid slabs. Water froze before it could be poured. Even air moved reluctantly. Outside, the city's stillness gleamed. Cobblestones wore a thin glass skin of ice, throwing back the lantern light in endless patterns. Horses stood patient and trembling, their hooves clicking faintly. Carts groaned and creaked as wheels fought the frost. Every movement sounded louder than it should, amplified by the emptiness. Shadows stretched long, shifting with the flicker of each lantern, playing tricks on weary eyes. The Thames lay silent, a silver expanse, solid and unmoving, but beneath it whispered, groaned and breathed. Fog drifted in slow, deliberate curls. Lanterns shimmered on the surface, reflections trembling like ghosts. And inside, a realization had taken root. Silence was no longer emptiness. It was presence. It was the companion of endurance. In this frozen city, to listen, to move with intention, was to survive. By the 23rd day, London had become a maze of glass. Each step a calculation, each street a mirror of light and danger. Cobblestones gleamed like crystal under flickering lamps. Footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off frost-coated walls. A single misstep sent a crack echoing through the stillness like breaking crystal. Street lamps, once steadfast, bowed beneath the frost. Glass globes fractured with delicate spider-web cracks. Metal posts leaned under the creeping weight of ice. Those that remained lit spilled weak, wavering light, their shadows splitting across the streets like broken glass. The darkness between them seemed thick enough to touch. And yet, people moved toward those small circles of light, drawn together by their glow. Horses snorted white steam, hooves clinking against the glassy ground. Carts creaked under the strain of frozen ruts. Children watched from behind frost-covered windows, pressing gloved hands to glass, imagining movement in the shadows. Even the wind had learned restraint, curling softly through the alleys instead of howling through them. It carried the sharp, metallic scent of ice and earth. Along the river, the frozen Thames glimmered like a shattered mirror. Barges stood motionless, ropes groaning, masts trembling under the weight of frost. Fog crept low, wrapping the city in a pale, ghostly shroud. The river seemed almost alive, breathing faintly beneath its shell of ice, a slow, deep pulse beneath a sleeping city. Inside the homes, families had learned to live with the fragility of the frozen streets beyond their doors. Candles flickered in the windows, their light trembling across walls and ceilings like faint breaths of defiance. Every movement carried weight, scraping frost from doorsteps, carrying water carefully to keep it from freezing, coaxing dull embers back to life. Even among cracked lamps and brittle streets, London's rhythm continued, quiet, patient, unbroken. Every small act was resistance against the unyielding rain of frost. By the 24th day, the courtyards tucked between London's old buildings seemed to breathe under the cold. Each one was its own miniature world, still, silent, but whispering with life. Ice clung to every surface. Puddles and gutters had hardened into glass, catching lantern light and scattering it in fractured patterns. Walls once warm with human touch were coated white, as though the city itself had inhaled frost. Children pressed gloved hands to frozen stone, tracing the delicate patterns that formed like veins across the ice. They watched in wonder as frost spread before their eyes, a living, growing tapestry of winter's design. Parents looked on, both moved and uneasy. Every sound, the squeak of a boot, the groan of a cart, the creak of timber, seemed louder, giving the still courtyards a fragile illusion of motion. The air hung heavy and metallic, carrying the scent of cold smoke, frozen earth, and iron frost that clung to hair and clothes alike. Breath turned instantly to mist, rising in small silver clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Even the smallest gestures, drawing a curtain, closing a door, passing a pot of stew, became careful, deliberate acts measured against the cold that seemed to seep deeper with every hour. The trees that survived stood rimmed with frost, their branches stiff and glittering like spun glass. Birds were scarce, gathering in clusters under whatever shelter they could find. Small animals burrowed deep beneath frozen debris, moving only when they had to. Life persisted quietly, intentionally, hidden within the folds and corners of the city's frozen heart. Inside the homes overlooking these courtyards, candlelight shimmered across frost-lined windows, casting shadows that danced along the ceilings and walls. The glow was faint but determined, a reminder that even in a city swallowed by ice and silence, warmth and life still fought to endure. Families drew close, wrapped in layers, sharing what heat and comfort they could. Each small act of tenderness became its own rebellion against the beautiful, merciless frost. By the 25th day, the cold itself seemed to have found a voice. It moved through the streets, pressing against windows and doors, slipping into cracks and seams, filling every silence with its invisible weight. Even sound seemed slowed, thickened by ice, as if the city had become a vast crystalline tomb where every motion was cautious and deliberate. Inside, families adjusted to the heavy hush. Fires burned low, embers coaxed with patience to last the night. Blankets and shawls layered one atop another, each one a small barrier against the cold pressing inward. Children slept curled tightly against their parents, their breath rising in soft white clouds that crystallized on pillows before fading away. Every gesture was thoughtful, stirring thick porridge, scraping frost from a window, passing a brick warmed by the hearth. Life had become a series of careful negotiations with the cold. Outside, the streets glimmered like rivers of ice. Lanterns fractured their light across slick cobblestones, scattering it in trembling shards. Footsteps whispered, skidding lightly on frozen stone, the sound thin and brittle as glass. Horses shifted their weight carefully, hooves tapping softly as carts creaked and groaned under the strain of frozen wheels. Shadows stretched unnaturally long in the lamplight, twisting familiar shapes into ghostly illusions. Even the most ordinary lanes took on a strange, uncertain menace. Along the Thames, the river mirrored the city's stillness, a wide sheet of frozen silver that groaned under its own weight. Fog rolled low, clinging to masts and embankments, curling around frozen debris. Lanterns shimmered faintly on the surface, scattering light in trembling reflections. Beneath it all came the quiet moan of shifting ice, a reminder that even stillness was alive, unpredictable, waiting. Inside, Londoners had learned to listen. Every sound mattered. The frost wasn't just an adversary, it was a teacher, demanding patience and precision. Life moved forward in small, deliberate increments. Each measured step, each rationed breath of warmth, each whispered word was an act of endurance. And in the quiet, one truth lingered: to survive, to protect what warmth remained. That was the city's heartbeat now. By the 26th day, night itself ruled London. The darkness had grown heavier, deeper, almost alive. It pressed against doors and windows, filled alleys, and draped thickly over the streets. Every shadow lingered too long, bending under lamplight into shapes that teased the eye. The frost coated everything, turning the city into a labyrinth of mirrors and sharp reflections. Inside, the night was measured in warmth and caution. Candles flickered sparingly, their light trembling against windows crusted with frost. Fireplaces were coaxed to life with care, coal added piece by piece like treasure spent wisely. Children clung to their parents, whispering softly, their breath rising in faint clouds that hung like ghosts in the air. Even the smallest actions, passing a pot of stew, adjusting a blanket, scraping frost from a window, were performed with slow precision, as if every movement carried weight in a city gripped by glass and silence. Outside, the streets had become perilous. Footsteps slid across ice, carts moaned under frozen wheels. Horses stepped carefully, breath misting in soft bursts. Lanterns wavered in pale light, reflections doubling and splitting across glassy pavements and fractured window panes. Even the wind moved carefully now, curling through alleys in slow spirals, carrying the faint tang of frost and frozen iron. Along the Thames, the river lay still, its surface groaning under the strain of ice and trapped water. Barges stood rigid, ropes stretched tight, masts trembling beneath the weight of frost. Fog crept along the banks, curling low over the ice and glinting with the fractured light of lanterns. The river seemed alive, aware, breathing in rhythm with the city itself. Inside, the lesson of the night was clear. Darkness and frost were not to be fought, but respected. And yet, life endured. In whispers, in warmth shared between bodies, in quiet acts of will. Every ember was a promise that London still lived. By the 27th day, the hearth had become the heart of the home, no longer just a place of comfort. It was sacred, the last fragile pulse of life in a city bound by ice. Flames were coaxed from fading embers with gentle hands. Each spark was an act of defiance. Coal, precious and rare, was fed slowly to the fire, each piece a decision. Families gathered close around the glow. Children pressed to their parents' sides, cheeks red, eyes wide in the flickering light. Blankets layered thick, bricks heated and wrapped in cloth to keep small hands warm. Every breath was careful, exhaled softly, the air turning to mist that lingered a moment before vanishing. Tiny ghosts of survival. Outside, the city remained silent and frozen. Streets shimmered with frost, reflecting the faint lamplight in fractured patterns. Carts creaked, horses moved with delicate precision, their hooves ringing faintly on the ice. Shadows bent and shifted across walls and alleys, making familiar places seem haunted and new. The stillness was vast, broken only by the occasional groan of wood or distant clatter, each sound amplified by the frozen air. Along the Thames, the ice reflected lantern light in 1,000 pieces, like shattered glass. Barges stood unmoving, their hulls creaking softly under shifting frost. Fog drifted in thin waves, carrying the faint metallic scent of frozen water and stone. Even the river seemed to hold its breath, sharing the city's slow rhythm, suspended between life and stillness. Inside, every hearth was a heartbeat. Every flicker of flame, every shared blanket, every whispered word was a small act of hope, proof that life still fought to endure beneath the relentless frost. By the 28th day, London's alleys had turned into corridors of glass and ice, narrow, treacherous passageways where lantern light fractured and scattered like shards. The cobblestones were slick and gleaming, reflecting pale gold and silver. Familiar paths had become strange and deceptive, forcing every traveller into a slow, deliberate dance with balance and fear. The air was sharp, metallic, filled with the faint scent of coal smoke and frozen earth. Each breath rose in soft white clouds, lingered for a heartbeat, and vanished. And so the city continued, frozen, luminous, alive in its silence. Every sound a signal, every breath a triumph, every flicker of light a reminder. Even in the coldest silence, life endures. Children peeked through frost-glazed windows, watching shadows shift across the walls, their imaginations painting shapes that may or may not have been there. Curiosity mingled with unease. The alleys were beautiful, yes, but dangerous too. They formed a glittering maze of ice that tested courage and balance with every step. Horses moved cautiously, hooves tapping and sliding, their breath rising in pale clouds that lingered like ghosts in the frozen air. Carts groaned as their wheels scraped against the ice, each movement slow, deliberate, wary. Even the wind seemed to know the fragility of this frozen world. It curled softly through the streets instead of rushing, carrying the faint scent of frost, mud, and distant coal fires. Along the frozen Thames, fog rolled low and slow, coiling around ice-locked barges and half-buried debris. The river itself seemed alive, murmuring beneath the weight of ice, while lantern light from the streets fractured across its surface, shimmering like 1,000 stars trapped in crystal. Inside their homes, families moved carefully, aware of the danger waiting beyond their frost-lined windows. Every candle, every ember, every shared blanket was a defense against the relentless cold pressing in from the frozen alleys, and in that crystalline labyrinth the city whispered its quiet truth: to endure, to move with patience, and to protect whatever warmth remained. That was the rhythm of life in a London held fast by frost. By the 29th day, London's bridges had become ghostly corridors of silver and ice. Frost coated every beam, rail, and stone in a delicate sheen, turning familiar structures into fragile sculptures that glimmered beneath dim lamplight. The Thames below was solid and shining, its frozen surface reflecting light in fractured patterns, giving the illusion of multiple worlds layered one atop another. Crossing a bridge required courage and care. Each step had to be measured against the slick surface, every movement deliberate, as though the ice itself were watching and testing those who dared to pass. From above, the city appeared otherworldly. Lanterns along the streets below flickered like scattered fireflies, their reflections dancing across the frozen river. Shadows stretched long and strange across icy pavements and still barges. Horses trod slowly, their hooves ringing softly, while carts creaked over frozen ruts, careful not to disturb the city's fragile balance. Even the wind moved with restraint, swirling gently around arches and beams, carrying the metallic scent of frost and frozen water. Families in nearby homes pressed close to their windows, gazing at the bridges with a mixture of fascination and fear. Children traced frost patterns on the glass, imagining the lives of those crossing the silvered river. Every sound, the low groan of ice, the soft thud of boots, the faint creak of a wheel, was magnified in the still air. Along the riverbanks, barges stood stiff, their ropes frozen taut, masts trembling beneath layers of ice. Fog drifted low, curling like a living thing around the edges of the frozen water, hiding familiar shapes and creating illusions of movement. And inside the warm homes overlooking these bridges, Londoners understood a fragile truth. Even amid relentless frost, life continued in careful, deliberate acts, each one a quiet rebellion against the cold and the silence it demanded. By the 30th day, the fog had found a voice of its own. It moved through streets and over rooftops, thick and purposeful, carrying the mingled scent of frost, coal smoke, and damp earth. Each swirl seemed alive, bending light and shadow into ghostly shapes. Walking through it felt like stepping into another world, familiar but slightly wrong, where every ordinary thing seemed awake and waiting. Inside, families watched from behind frost-lined windows. Children pressed their noses to the glass, eyes wide as lantern beams fractured and danced in the mist. Parents whispered softly, their voices low, preserving the fragile warmth of their rooms. Thanks for watching. Good night, sweet dreams wait for second part.